Okay, so before getting into the content, the point of view what I'm trying to bring in is the use cases for the O-RAN SMO. So we have been consumer of O-RAN SMO for several months. So the point of view of is what we wanted to bring into the table. The point of view is primarily driven by the system integrators and the customers who wanted to adopt O-RAN SMO and move to the production. So that's a baseline for this use case. So, so as you already know that O-RAN SMO has been containerized, and this is the special package from ONAP SDNR. So the beauty of this containerization is the use cases what I'm going to talk about is, so it's basically the use cases are primarily fall into two categories. One is like, distributed deployments or centralized deployments. Okay, so the distributed deployments, what I'm saying is like, see, there are different system integrators who are asking the use cases like, hey, we have primarily like, a closed source vendor who is having their already existing EMS and which is behind their RU device. So how can we adopt O-RAN SMO to them? So, and to cater that, like, so the containerization of O-RAN SMO helps literally like, so the solution what we are providing to them is to adopt O-RAN SMO is like, hey, you can have a centralized deployment where one of the O-RAN SMO instance running and handling your EMS and another O-RAN SMO handling the CUTU devices. So the distributed deployment is the primary use case which is kind of being asked by our system integrators who are working with like, closed source vendors who wanted to adopt the O-RAN SMO. That's one. And the centralized one is basically like, for example, it's a standard use case where like, suppose if the RUDU is running, not RUDU, yeah, RUDU running on the edge site, for example, and CU is running on like, on a centralized location. How do we adopt O-RAN SMO to cater this kind of 5G private deployment specifically? So these are the use cases which like, the industry and the system integrators are asking us the questions. So these are the solutions which we brought in. So before even giving to the system integrators, like, we need to, test it, right? So when I said testing, like, there is actually a functional gap. When I said functional gap, what I mean is like, so how do we test them? Like, because we want, the community has got the simulators. The community tests them using the simulators, have provided simulators, but it is a lot of functional gap. Like, because the simulators cannot be used to test critical use cases. If they ask about like, scalable scenarios, not possible today. So that's where like, we picked in the community simulators and started enhancing the simulators to provide the broader use cases and testing and benchmarking results for the system integrators to test. Hey, this is the data where like, because the system integrators wants the confidence before even they start doing their system integration testing in their development environment, right? So this is what the use cases and this is what the perception and the contributions what we did for the O-RAN SMO and the O-RAN SMO simulator. So while doing that enhancements, like, when I said enhancement, like, for example, one of the ask is like, if I wanted to perform a file management use case, let's say file management is an underlying use case for many things. Like, for example, user wanted to say like, I wanted the performance data from the RU. Okay, the file which gets generated in RU, I want that to be managed, and the centralized console of O-RAN SMO should display that. How do I do that? Is there any KPIs available? Is there any dashboards available? So these are the kinds of asks. So what we did is like, we have enhanced those use cases, in the sense enhance the simulators to provide those support fundamentally, like, the file management support, and we brought in the other components. For example, the utility components like DFC, okay, distributed file controller, like, where like, when the file is ready, okay, there is a WES notification comes, the DFC picks it up, put it into the SMO. So these are the kind of end-to-end use cases which the system integrators specifically want to test their production deployments, right? So this is what the use cases which I wanted to talk about. So bridging the functional gap between the simulators and validating the end-to-end use cases. And as I mentioned, like, the critical part here is the interoperability testing. So the interoperability testing, like, can be cannot be done much with the simulators because simulators are simulators. Even though no matter how much functional we enhance, it's just still the interoperability test gap is there, right? So for that, we have collaborated with some of the CUDU vendors, and we have tested the scenarios, okay? And when we are testing the scenarios, lots of gaps have been identified, and those gaps have been filled, and eventually those things will get upstream to the community, okay? So this is primarily the use case. What I'm talking about is the private 5G deployment. So, yeah. And there is also an ask with respect to the A1 interface, like, how exactly the A1 interface helps, because the O-RAN SMO supports the non-RT-RIC and the RT-RIC communication through A1 interface, right? So how does that work? Like, when it comes to the X apps, like, if user wanted to, the system integrators wanted to use the X apps and R apps, how does that flow? Because the thing is, it's not just the whole purpose of SMO is not to do the configuration management or provisioning management. Those are not the simple asks, actually. So even though it started with that, but the system integrators or the customers are asking about, like, okay, what's next? How is my end-to-end scenario works? I have my own X apps. I have my own R apps. How can I do them? How can I test them? Like, the end-to-end flow. How do I get, for example, the KPIs captured from the RU device? How can I present it on my O-RAN SMO dashboard? So these are the asks which are being asked by the system integrators and some of the customers. So what we did is, like, as I mentioned, the functional gap we have filled, and also we have a next step. We have implemented the end-to-end workflows, which are, like, file management, performance management, trace management. So that's the next step we approach. And the next thing is, like, we wanted to extend it to use the A1 interface, so that whoever is the customer brings in their X apps will be able to get their KPIs captured by the SMO and distribute it and display it. If it is a distributed deployment, like, it can go to the corresponding SMO instance where it has to go. If it is a centralized deployment, it will display on the centralized console dashboard. So this is kind of the work in progress, the last step which I spoke about. But this is what our basically contributions to the O-RAN SMO. Yeah, that's basically pretty much in the nutshell. Thank you.